Have you ever discovered someone living in your house without you knowing? My old apartment neighbor was a remarkably peaceful man with whom I shared a genuine friendship. He was truly the kind of soul who wouldn't hurt a fly. However, his daily reality was dictated by a severe diagnosis of schizophrenia, which, due to the intermittent cessation of his prescription medication because of its harsh side effects, often triggered intense visual and auditory hallucinations. Our casual interactions were regular, but his updates soon began to take a highly unsettling turn. One afternoon, he pulled me aside to confess that he had started sleeping permanently inside his ceramic bathtub, claiming it was the only spatial boundary where he could escape the nocturnal torment of a hostile entity. A couple of weeks later, his delusions escalated. He informed me that he had shifted his entire bedding setup into the overhead ceiling crawl space because he was now fully convinced that the manifestation was emerging directly through the plumbing fixtures and water taps downstairs to catch him. I listened to his experiences with deep empathy, completely unaware that the physical architecture of our building was about to weave his psychological crisis directly into my own living quarters. Our apartment complex featured an old, interconnected service loft that spanned the entire length of the building's upper framework. In theory, a basic internal stud partition separated my unit's overhead ceiling from his. Driven by the frantic need to expand his sanctuary against the hallucinations, my neighbor quietly dismantled the flimsy drywall barrier dividing our respective zones, merging the roof framing of our homes into a single, unmonitored corridor. Because of that hidden structural modification, he spent 14 consecutive nights sleeping directly above my mattress, while I rested downstairs, relying on the structural integrity of my home. A man deep inside a severe psychological episode was lying completely motionless, just a few inches above my head, on the other side of the ceiling panel. Discovering the layout of what had happened completely froze my blood. I was never afraid of him as a human being, but realizing that the absolute perimeter of my domestic privacy had been compromised without my consent shattered my peace of mind. I immediately hired a specialist to bolt down a heavy-duty mechanical deadbolt directly onto my ceiling access hatch. The horror wasn't the threat of physical violence, but the chilling realization of how easily you can share the exact same air with someone else's darkness when the only line defense between you is a sheet of drywall torn down in the silent dark. Cultural note: in clinical psychiatry, severe psychotic episodes stemming from conditions like paranoid schizophrenia completely dismantle an individual's perception of their surroundings. During an acute phase, patients can experience extreme persecutory delusions or auditory hallucinations, leading them to believe that their own walls or ceilings are closing in, or that hostile forces are trapping them. This completely erases their ability to recognize property boundaries. For a subject in the midst of a crisis, breaking into a neighbor's home, even by destroying physical barriers or crawling through utility spaces, is not a conscious criminal act, but a desperate survival response to a terrifying threat that exists solely in their mind. This terrifying series of events directly affected an ex-girlfriend of mine back in the mid-90s. At the time, she was renting a small single-family home down in Florida, raising her daughter who was just a newborn infant. To keep her household afloat, she worked grueling night shifts as a server at a high-volume restaurant right along the beachfront. Being a young woman, her daily routine naturally required constant interaction with a large base of regular customers. Unbeknownst to her, one specific individual developed a dangerous pathological obsession with her, meticulously tracking her commutes until he pinpointed the exact location of her residential perimeter. From that moment on, a silent breach was established within the property. Every single time she left the house to cover her shifts, The perimeter was compromised. The intruder located a secondary access point leading to the upper framing of the structure, setting up a permanent, hidden living space in the pitch black of the attic. He cohabited inside that secret void for an extended period without raising a single red flag. Initially, the warning signs were entirely psychological. She began noticing subtle alterations in the kitchen inventory. Select food items vanished from the pantry, and several of the baby's clean bottles disappeared without a trace. Attributing these incidents to extreme physical exhaustion and the stress of being a working single mother, she tried to normalize the missing items, assuming she was just misplacing them. However, the persistent loss of supplies began to generate a thick, inescapable wave of paranoia throughout the household. The breaking point manifested late one night, when she invited a small group of close friends over after wrapping up her shift. As they sat talking in the living room, a sudden dead silence gripped the space. They were abruptly interrupted by an unmistakable auditory cue coming from the ceiling, directly above their heads. The loud, rhythmic sound of a heavy body dragging itself on hands and knees echoed through the wooden floorboards. Someone was slowly pacing their movements in the dark. Instinct took over. She grabbed her infant from the crib, and the entire group evacuated the house at full speed, running to the safety of the nearest neighbor's property to contact emergency dispatchers. Multiple police cruisers arrived within minutes, entering the home with flashlights and service weapons to conduct a tactical sweep of the roof structure. After several tense minutes, the officers descended from the hatch, escorting the intruder out. It was in that exact microsecond that the psychological horror acquired a face. The man in the attic was the very same customer from the restaurant who had been stalking her in secret. When authorities inspected the upper crawl space, they discovered the criminal had built a functional makeshift shelter hidden in the insulation dust. The most sickening detail of the sweep was realizing that the stalker had collected the child's missing bottles to store his own biological waste, ensuring he never had to walk downstairs and guaranteeing his complete invisibility while monitoring her life from just inches above the ceiling. Cultural note: in mid to late 20th century residential architecture across the American South, central heating and ventilation systems required expansive, interconnected attic crawl spaces that spanned the entire layout of the household. These structural voids were frequently accessible through simple drop-down panels located in unmonitored utility closets or outdoor carports. Because these areas were rarely synced to the home's primary security systems of the era, they represented a severe structural vulnerability that allowed external stalkers to engage in prolonged phrogging undetected. During my time in law school, I lived in one of the most notorious party houses in the entire town. People were constantly coming and going at all hours of the day and night. Because of that chaotic environment, we developed a very relaxed policy. We routinely let people stay the night on the couch or just hang out in the living room whenever they wanted to. One specific guy we knew from the local scene started hanging around a lot more than usual. My roommates and I typically retreated to our own private rooms to study or sleep after a long night, so his constant presence just seemed subtly normal within the general layout of the property. Every single morning, this guy would be crashed out on the living room sofa. To us, nothing seemed different from the usual pattern of random people staying over after a heavy party chat, so we didn't think anything of it for weeks. It was only after he casually started taking daily showers at our place and keeping his personal toiletries in the bathroom that the reality of the situation finally clicked. We sat down and did the math. This individual had stealthily moved into our house over the course of 2 full months without anyone ever giving him permission. When we finally confronted him about his living arrangements, his demeanor shifted. He honestly admitted that he was going through a rough patch and literally did not have another place to go at the time. We called an emergency house meeting with all the roommates to discuss the situation. After a long debate, we decided to let him stay for a short while longer. He explained he was already planning on moving down to Texas for his next school semester, and to be fair, his presence hadn't really been that much of a physical imposition on our daily routines up to that point. Eventually, the departure date arrived, he packed his bags for Texas, and that was that. However, there is a hilarious and incredibly awkward aside to this entire experience. The dude was completely lacking any form of social awareness or basic boundaries. Over those 2 months, he managed to accidentally walk in on literally every single roommate in the house during their most private and intimate moments in their bedrooms. Instead of turning around and leaving promptly like any normal human being would do, he would just stand directly in the doorway. He would proceed to casually ask them a bunch of random questions about where to find a cigarette lighter or some other stupid piece of junk. It was definitely an interesting and deeply uncomfortable time in that house. Cultural note: in American university towns, large student rentals often operate under an informal open couch policy, where social circles treat common areas as communal lodging. This specific subculture provides an ideal environment for stealth living, a variant of phrogging where individuals exploit the high turnover of guests and the lack of communication between busy roommates to effectively move into a property without paying rent or signing a lease. This is my very first post on this platform. I will try my best to keep the text short, but I need to include some critical details. I am deeply convinced that my mother is dealing with an active phrogging situation inside her own property. To give you some essential backstory, my parents legally separated back in the year 2017. My mom moved out of state for a while, where she ended up living with an incredibly toxic partner. To help her escape that environment, our family coordinated to bring her back home. She is currently living in our original family residence to get her footing back. My parents are actually better friends than partners now, so that dynamic is totally fine. The main issue is that my dad works out of state constantly, so the property is empty most of the time. Around that same time, I purchased my very first home and moved out. Because of those shifting schedules, the family house sat completely empty of people for about 3 full months before she arrived. During that specific window, I personally drove over to check on the property every other day to ensure its physical security. We even had active digital security cameras installed at the time. Everything seemed fine until she officially moved back in. Over the course of the last few months, a series of deeply suspicious activities started popping up. Our house features 2 separate access points to the attic framing, one located inside the garage and another in the main hallway ceiling. First, we noticed that heavy utility wires inside the roof were being completely rerouted. Structural wooden boards were being shifted around from their original positions. Then the small square access hatch in the garage ceiling was left wide open. That panel had not been touched or altered in over 15 years. We also started finding random white paint splatters on different sections of the drywall, and small pieces of wooden trim were being carefully removed and re-stapled back into place. Soon after, the physical sounds began. We started hearing heavy bangs and rhythmic shuffling coming from both sides of the attic spaces. Around that same time, I suddenly lost complete administrative control over our security cameras. The network was compromised, so we had to disconnect them entirely. Our home internet was also being drained by an unknown device, forcing my mom to cancel her web subscription. Next thing we know, her personal cell phone was completely hacked. The absolute turning point happened last week. My mom walked into her master bedroom and noticed large, muddy shoe prints pressed into the carpet, leading straight toward her private closet. Lately, the intrusion has moved straight into the kitchen area. Brand new cartons of milk and orange juice are being opened overnight with just a small amount missing. Slices of bread are vanishing from the loaf, clean dishes are being shifted around the counters, and we even found a disposable coffee cup lid sitting by the sink. My mom does not drink coffee at all. Desperate for answers, we purchased 2 heavy trail cameras and physically bolted them into the attic rafters. One camera only managed to capture a sudden bright flashlight glare before going dark. The second camera was completely tampered with. Someone had opened the casing and stolen the internal memory card. Luckily, we had been using old-school disposable cameras to take before and after pictures of every single structural change in the house, so we have physical proof of random items appearing out of nowhere. We are completely at a loss right now. We have no home internet, no active security system, and my mom is stuck with a barely functioning phone. The local police are refusing to do anything unless we can provide clear video evidence of an actual human face entering the perimeter. They won't even step inside to clear the attic space. We have searched every corner ourselves, even checking narrow gaps that couldn't possibly fit an adult body. My mom's mental health is completely stable. Her recent medical evaluations are clear, so she isn't imagining these flags. We cannot afford a private investigator. Our very last resort is to install advanced security cameras that operate exclusively off cellular data networks synced straight to my personal phone. Nobody in our social circle believes us, and this online forum is our absolute last hope. Cultural note. One of the greatest challenges in modern home security is the law enforcement gap regarding cyberstalking. When a homeowner reports that their cameras or network are being remotely compromised, local police often dismiss it as a software glitch or connectivity issue. This lack of technical training leaves victims completely vulnerable, forcing them to rely on analog workarounds while the intruder continues to exploit the system. This entire situation unfolded within the perimeter of our family property, specifically on the private residential dock where we kept our leisure vessel. During the peak of an incredibly severe winter, I started picking up on some unmistakable physical signs that a stranger was clandestinely occupying the layout. Since I never once caught a glimpse of a human face in the area, I figured they must only access the structure to sleep during the freezing night hours. At the time, I was completely remodeling the interior cabin space. Because of the ongoing construction projects, there were no valuable items left on board that could be targeted for theft inside the floating extension of our home. The winter weather bordering the wilderness was becoming absolutely brutal. Moved by a sense of empathy regarding the harsh climate, I made a conscious choice to leave the main deck hatch completely unlatched from the outside. I even went out of my way to leave a pair of heavy thermal blankets near the hallway entry. The structure still featured its original cushioned benches, along with a fully functioning utility bathroom. For the first few weeks, the dynamic went smoothly in total anonymity. Every morning, I would head out to the dock to continue my carpentry work in the lower staterooms. Whenever I found small personal items left behind by the transient that interfered with my tools, I would just quietly shift them around with care. I even started leaving behind portions of my lunch or a worn thermos on the wooden table surface. But then, the entire situation violently shifted during a routine technical inspection of the main propulsion system. I walked out to the lower deck area and opened up the heavy metallic access panel to the engine compartment located directly beneath the floorboards. The moment I shone my flashlight down into the deep framing gap, my stomach completely turned. This individual had not only ignored the clean utility bathroom just a few feet away, but they had actively dismantled major sections of the electrical wiring and the thermal engine insulation to construct a long-term hidden nest. The expensive machinery was completely compromised, covered in accumulated biological waste, dirty paper, and a massive collection of organic debris that completely bricked the mechanical operations of the property. The intruder had been tampering with critical high-voltage components while I was working just inches above their head. My sympathy instantly vanished in that exact microsecond. I realized the immense physical danger we had been exposed to within our own property lines. I frantically gathered every single piece of their belongings from the engine gap, packed them into an industrial trash bag, and threw them straight into the exterior dumpster. I locked down the main hatch with heavy-duty security padlocks and fully secured the dock perimeter. I immediately installed a high-decibel electronic alarm system on the framing, mostly because I was terrified they would return, realize they were locked out, and attempt to start a fire or destroy our property in retaliation. The chilling reality of knowing someone was altering the infrastructure right beneath my feet completely shattered my sense of security. Cultural note: in residential perimeter security, recreational vessels docked at private residential slips during the winter off-season represent frequent targets for localized phrogging networks. The lack of movement on private docks, combined with the high-volume insulation properties of fiberglass hulls, attract individuals looking for long-term shelter. Security professionals note that these secondary structures often become compromised spaces where structural tampering and system sabotage pose a direct threat to the safety and utility of the main household. This whole situation went down exactly 7.5 years ago, right on the 23rd of June. At the time, I was in the middle of clearing out my entire house. I had been renting this specific property for about a year, and my lease was almost up. I wasn't planning on renewing it for the following year, so it was time to start packing up my belongings and shifting everything to my next location. The house I had at that moment was rather small, but it featured plenty of functional space for just a single person. I lived there completely alone. I had just finished clearing out the living room, leaving only some basic structural furniture behind, and I was starting to tackle the kitchen area. The kitchen featured a massive amount of storage cabinets. In fact, there were so many of them that I didn't even use a good portion of the lower shelves. I started looking through some of those abandoned cabinets just to ensure I hadn't left any of my own personal items inside them over the months. I opened one of the deep corner cabinets, and I instantly spotted something weird sitting in the very back corner. It looked like a pile of dirty clothes or an old cloth rags. I reached my arm inside to grab the fabric. I knew for a fact it didn't belong to me, but as I pulled it away, the movement suddenly revealed a small white plastic handle that was barely visible in the shadows. This specific cabinet was tucked away in the deep corner right by the kitchen sink, partially blocked from view by the heavy cooking stove. At first glance, I subtly assumed the handle was just a structural part of the plumbing or a utility line, but something about the shape just looked subtly different to me. Curious, I actually crawled completely inside the cabinet framing, which turned out to be surprisingly spacious. Once my entire body was inside, I saw the true layout. There was a tiny hidden access door built straight into the side panel, leading directly into the interior wall. I could honestly barely believe my own eyes. You had to be completely inside the dark cabinet structure just to see the physical details. I decided to pull the handle and open the hatch. It revealed an extremely narrow dark hallway that opened into a dusty crawl space running behind the kitchen drywall. As I crept further into the darkness, a massive wave of panic hit me. I saw a collection of discarded food items scattered on the floorboard, along with several heavy winter blankets laid out like a makeshift bed. It looked exactly as if someone had been actively living inside my walls. The only good news, at least for my immediate safety, was that the narrow space appeared completely empty at that exact second. Whoever had been using it was gone. I stood there trying to process the logic of the situation, wondering how long this individual had been occupying the structure and how I had never noticed a single red flag. I was often away from the property due to my demanding work shifts and other personal routines, but it still made me feel subtly sick to realize it was physically possible for a stranger to inhabit my home without my knowledge. I tried to shake it off and continued packing my things until it got late. The next day, right after wrapping up my shift at work, I returned to continue the move. I was still in a complete state of shock regarding the secret room behind my sink. My mind couldn't stop racing, so I decided to go look at the crawl space one more time just to confirm I wasn't losing my sanity. I opened the kitchen cabinet, crawled inside, and reached for the white handle just like I had done the previous afternoon. But this time, the exact moment I unlatched the door, I caught a sudden flash of movement. For a split second, I saw a human figure crouching in the dark gap. Before I could even scream, the intruder violently slammed the heavy door back into my face. The loud thud echoed through the cabinet. Adrenaline took over. I instantly spun my body around, scrambled out of the cabinet, and ran at full speed out of the house. I made it straight to my car, locking myself inside the cabin. My hands were shaking violently as I opened my cell phone to contact the emergency line. I was so terrified that I actually started driving away from the property while speaking to the operator. I explained the entire nightmare to the dispatcher, and a couple of police cruisers arrived at the house shortly after. The officers conducted a thorough sweep of the crawl space, only to find that the individual had already fled the perimeter through another exit. I was completely disgusted and physically ill knowing that this random stranger had full, unrestricted access to my living space for God knows how long. It felt like a very vivid waking nightmare. When I looked down at my phone screen to verify the call log, the digital display clearly read June 23, 2016. I can still recall that specific date perfectly all these years later. The memory stayed with me like a deep psychological scar, a scar that I honestly don't know if I will ever fully heal from. Fortunately for me, my move-out date was already scheduled for the following week, so I handed over the keys and never looked back. I still don't know the true extent of how long that person inhabited my secret room, but thankfully, they never tried to confront me or cause any physical harm. If you are listening to this, please take my advice. Even if you think your property is completely secure, always lock your exterior doors. You can never truly know what desperate people are capable of once they manage to slip inside your home. Cultural note. In suburban residential architecture across Europe and Scandinavia, older rental properties often featured integrated service chases or dead spaces behind large kitchen cabinetry to allow access to centralized main water valves and drainage pipes. If these access panels lack secure interior latches, they present a severe security vulnerability, allowing displaced individuals or squatter networks to utilize the hidden gaps as makeshift shelters directly adjacent to the active living spaces of the tenants. I have a rather wild experience to share, and while I am not entirely positive if it fits the exact definition of phrogging, it still creeps me out to this day. Back when I was attending grade 6, I lived with my mother and my uncle in a house located in the downtown area of Prince George, British Columbia. My uncle worked full-time as a carpenter, which meant he was out of town for projects a significant amount of time. My mom worked a few blocks away in the city center, and my school was just a short walk down the street. Because of our routines, the house was often completely empty during the day. One afternoon, a random little old lady wearing a traditional kilt showed up on our porch. She knocked aggressively on our door, accompanied by a massive but completely silent middle-aged man. When I answered, she demanded to see someone named Metro, I politely informed her that she had the wrong address, so she and the large man turned around and left the property. About a week or so later, the exact same lady came back. This time, only my mom was home. When the stranger demanded to see the same individual and received the same answer, her demeanor shifted instantly. She became super agitated and started screaming at my mom, telling her to get out of her house. My mom shared the unsettling encounter with me when I got home later that evening, but we tried to brush it off as a random mental health episode. This is the exact point where things got incredibly weird. A few days later, I came home from school and immediately noticed a brand new clock hanging on the kitchen wall. We used to have a simple black analog clock with gold trim hanging right above the stove. That clock was completely gone. In its place was an old vintage clock that looked like it had been crudely carved out of a thick slice of firewood. I noticed the switch, but I did not really think much of it. I just assumed my uncle had come back from a job and brought a new item home, since it was his property after all. Then I opened the fridge to grab a drink and spotted a six-pack of Budweiser sitting on the shelf. My uncle was a heavy drinker, but he was strictly a Pilsner guy. He never touched Budweiser. To add to the confusion, I walked into the living room and noticed my mom's ceramic ashtray was absolutely packed to the brim with cigarette butts. It was completely overflowing. Both my mom and my uncle smoked, but never that much in a single morning. I wondered if they had guests over while I was away at school, but I didn't stress about it. A week later, the puzzle pieces violently came together. I was sitting in my bedroom playing video games when I heard the sound of our heavy front door opening with extreme force. Our entryway featured single-pane glass, so if you slammed that door, it would shake all the surrounding windows and make a loud vibration. Right after the slam, the unmistakable voice of that exact same old lady started echoing through the hallway, screaming at the top of her lungs for us to get out of her house. Luckily, we had a sturdy metal chain latch secured on the frame, which was the only physical barrier stopping her from walking straight into our living room. My mom was frantically standing with her foot pressed hard against the wood, yelling at me to call the emergency line. I scrambled for the phone, desperately wondering where that massive guy from her first visit was hiding. While I was speaking to the operator, the lady managed to force half of her head through the narrow gap in the door, screaming threats directly at us. In the middle of the chaos, my cat started casually walking toward the opening, putting himself right within swinging range of the intruder. I was trying to lunge forward and grab the pet, but I was restricted by the short cord of the landline phone. It was absolute madness. Suddenly, I saw a large figure walk up directly behind the old lady in our entryway. My initial thought was that the quiet, massive man had returned to back her up. But as the figure stepped into the light, I realized it was actually my uncle returning early from a job. My uncle was a very big, surly contractor, and the moment he confronted her, the old lady's aggressive attitude vanished into thin air. We quickly unlatched the lock to let him inside, and a couple of police cruisers arrived shortly after. The responding officers informed us that they were highly familiar with this specific woman, explaining that she struggled with severe unmedicated delusions. But the most terrifying realization came after the police took her away. When we sat down to connect the dots, we realized that the vintage wooden clock, the Budweiser cans in the fridge, and the massive pile of cigarette butts all belonged exclusively to her. She had been using a hidden method to enter our home every single day while we were away at work and school. She was literally just lounging in our living room, chugging our beverages, smoking her cigarettes, and even hanging her own ugly decorations on our walls. It was a sickening discovery. My mom spent the next 2 full days obsessively scrubbing every single inch of our house with heavy disinfectants. The part that still gives me chills happened a month later when we finally prepared to move out of that property. While clearing out the storage spaces, we discovered a pile of empty Budweiser cans hidden in the deep, dark corners of the basement. My mom tried to shrug it off to keep me calm, but I am absolutely positive that the lady was inside the structure on those previous days. Whenever she heard our keys in the front door, she would frantically run down into the basement and hide in the dark until we went to sleep. I will never be able to fully describe the sheer weight of relief I felt the moment my uncle walked into that entryway and altered the entire dynamic of the situation. Rest in peace, Uncle Roger. Cultural note. In older Canadian residential properties, particularly in regions like British Columbia, homes built mid-century often utilize secondary utility entrances or coal chutes leading directly into crawl spaces and basements. These architectural layouts allowed individuals experiencing severe displacement or mental health crises to establish covert access to a property, frequently using the lower levels as a hidden sanctuary while tracking the daily schedules of the residents above to access the main living spaces. This whole experience is from my own memory, so I apologize if I get some of the tiny specifics wrong, but I am absolutely positive that I remember the main points of the case. A few years back, a man down in Florida was being heavily investigated by the local police for a serious crime. Right in the middle of the active investigation, the guy suddenly went missing, vanishing without a trace. Shortly after his disappearance, his wife quietly put their family home on the market and sold it. The detectives interviewed her extensively for days, but she apparently had no idea where he was hiding. His trail went completely cold. Eventually, a new family bought the property and moved into the house. After a period of several months of living there, they started noticing some issues with the temperature control inside the building. They finally called an HVAC technician to come out and do a thorough inspection of the property, because the family was constantly complaining about the poor performance of the air conditioning. They subtly assumed there might be a physical leak somewhere in the system. During the inspection, the technician crawled into the structural spaces and made a sickening discovery. He uncovered a hidden room that had been custom built directly into the narrow crawl space right above the garage. The secret room was fully hooked up to the house's electricity. It had an active duct that tapped right into the main HVAC system, a functional cable television connection with a small TV set, a made bed, and a mini fridge. The space also contained piles of clothes, and the investigators even found signs of rudimentary plumbing hooks. It became clear that the wanted fugitive had been secretly living in that narrow space long after the new family had moved into the house. The technician found that the food items inside the mini fridge were not spoiled at all, proving the room had been used very recently. The family also connected the dots on a few weird occurrences. Several small items that had mysteriously gone missing from the main house after they moved in, like kitchen utensils and specific tools, were found sitting right inside the hidden room. If I remember correctly, the authorities did eventually catch the guy somewhere else entirely, but he had never risked returning to that hidden garage space after the technician accidentally exposed his hiding spot. Cultural note. In criminology, there is a documented pattern where fugitives or former homeowners facing legal action choose to hide inside their former properties instead of fleeing. Since they know the blueprints, blind spots, and structural vulnerabilities better than anyone, they can operate invisibly, navigating areas they know the new residents will never bother to check. Like what you see? Subscribe to the Reddit Oracle for more. This whole nightmare went down a little over 10 years ago. My old house had recently flooded, and I ended up losing almost everything I owned. I was completely desperate to find a new place to live. Luckily, A good buddy of mine stepped up and told me I could rent one of his secondary properties while he was away out of town. The deal was incredibly simple. I just had to cover the monthly utilities and keep the property clean. Another close friend of mine was also struggling to find a place at the time, so the timing felt absolute perfect. The house itself was kind of a total dump, but the rent was only $150 a month. My friend and I packed our remaining things and moved right in. The place was in such a terrible state that we had to spend our entire first week doing heavy manual labor just to make it habitable. To make matters worse, the structure was heavily infested with massive, aggressive spiders. They were crawling everywhere. Frustrated, we went out and bought a massive case of industrial bug bombs. We cracked them open and literally threw them around like smoke grenades into each room, then left the property for the entire day while the place fumigated. In hindsight, we used about 10 times the recommended amount of chemicals. When we returned after 8 hours, the air was unbreathable, so we actually went in with gas-powered leaf blowers and blew all the chemical dust straight out the open windows. It definitely wasn't one of my wisest choices. During the chaos, I had gone up to the 3rd floor to try to lob one of the canisters up there, but the door at the top of the landing was heavily locked. Looking through a small gap, the space appeared to just be filled with old cardboard boxes and random packaging trash. I figured there was no purpose to go up there anyway. But on my way back down the wooden stairs, I picked up on a very disgusting detail. I noticed a large amount of biological waste scattered all over the steps. I subtly assumed it was from stray cats, dogs, or God knows what else. That night, the illusion of safety completely shattered. I was sitting in my room playing a PC game while my buddy went into the bathroom to clean up. Suddenly, I heard him scream and swear at the top of his lungs. He came running into my room, his face pale, and yelled, "Dude, there's someone standing outside looking straight through the window, watching me take a shower." I rushed back into the bathroom with him. Sure enough, there was a strange, middle-aged woman staring directly through the glass. She honestly looked like that creepy bus driver character from South Park. I grabbed a heavy black garbage bag and frantically taped it right over the window frame. The terrifying part is that she just kept staring through the glass the entire time, maintaining direct eye contact with me as I covered the view. I immediately ran outside to confront her, but she had already vanished into the shadows of the yard. The next day was Saturday. I woke up early, brewed a fresh pot of coffee, and stood at the back window looking out at the yard. I was trying to stay positive, thinking to myself, I am going to make this work. It has been a rough year. The living arrangement sucks, but I am going to survive this. I took my very first sip of coffee, and the silence was quickly shaken by a jarring, heavy scraping sound coming from directly above our heads. My buddy ran into the kitchen, his eyes wide, and whispered, "What the hell is that sound?" We heard a series of loud slamming noises, more heavy scraping, and then, out of nowhere, a full-size couch came flying straight out of the 3rd floor window. It crashed violently onto the ground right in front of the glass we were standing at, smashing into a million wooden bits. Before we could even process the shock, the mystery woman came running down the stairs. She frantically dragged the broken couch up the dirt hill, poured a gallon of gasoline all over it, and lit it on fire. She left it to burn in the yard and ran straight back up the stairs. We were completely floored. I decided to brave the situation and head up to the 3rd floor to demand some real answers. When I pounded on the locked door, she actually answered. She casually explained that she had been living up there the entire time. I was deeply confused. Why hadn't the owner of the house warned us about her? She then complained that she had smelled something funny the previous afternoon, and suddenly all sorts of bugs and spiders started invading her room. Her couch was apparently filled with fleeing pests, so she threw it out the window to burn them all. That was also the exact moment we realized there was no functioning bathroom up on that third floor. Suddenly, the disgusting mystery on the staircase made a whole lot of sickening sense. Cultural note: in older American residential properties, particularly those converted into cheap multifamily rentals, the upper attics or third floors were often utilized as independent storage spaces that lacked independent plumbing systems. These unlisted units became prime targets for covert squatting or phrogging, as individuals could easily access the property using old master keys or unsecured side doors, utilizing the shared staircases during late-night hours when the main residents were fast asleep. I was very young when this happened, maybe only 2 years old. We were living in a classic, narrow row home down in South Baltimore. It was just me, my mom, and my stepdad. Over the course of a few weeks, random stuff around the house kept going missing. My parents worked demanding shifts, and I stayed with a nanny during their working hours. Because of their chaotic schedules, they just assumed the other partner had misplaced the items. They didn't really think anything was seriously amiss in our home. Then came the day that changed everything. My parents walked through the front door after work, and the entire place was completely cleaned out. The intruder took all our electronics, our valuables, and for some bizarre reason, they even stole my favorite Garfield pillow. My parents immediately called the local police. 2 officers showed up at the property and decided to conduct a thorough room-by-room sweep of the entire house. Our basement was old, featuring a damp dirt floor and only a single bare light bulb hanging from the ceiling. That light was located on the right side of the stairs, right near the washer and dryer unit. The left side of the basement was pitch black, super dark, and only utilized for storing stacks of old cardboard boxes. Nobody ever went over there. As the officers shone their heavy flashlights into the darkness, they noticed something unnatural. Someone had carefully constructed a false brick wall on that exact side, hiding a narrow crawl space. A stranger had been living directly behind that wall, right beneath our feet. As it turns out, the intruder was actually our landlord's nephew, who was dealing with severe mental health issues. He had somehow acquired a copy of our house key. The investigators believe he likely never meant us any physical harm, but he was deeply unstable and struggling with a heavy substance addiction. The moment they pulled him out from behind the bricks, he was permanently sent to a secure mental facility. Cultural note: in historical East Coast cities like Baltimore, row homes built during the 19th and early 20th centuries frequently featured unfinished cellars with dirt floors and structural stone partitions. These architectural blind spots, combined with access keys retained by property owners or family members, provided ideal conditions for long-term concealment, as the muffled acoustics of brick foundations prevented residents from hearing movement below. It all started when I lost my job back in 2020. For a while, I managed to survive entirely on unemployment benefits, but when that financial safety net suddenly vanished in the early winter of that same year, everything collapsed. I was forced out of my apartment with nowhere to go. I spent a few desperate days bumming around, trying to couch surf with acquaintances, but nobody had room for me. As the winter weather grew increasingly harsh, desperation took over. My body was freezing, and my mind was racing. In the middle of that panic, I suddenly remembered an old coworker who lived in a quiet neighborhood just down the street. I had been to his place a few times in the past, because our significant others used to be friends. To be honest, I never really liked either of them, but I was running out of options. I distinctly remembered where they kept their spare house key. I waited until I knew they were away from home, crept up to the porch, and checked the hiding spot. The key was still there. The The moment I unlocked the door and stepped inside, a massive rush of anxiety hit me. I was completely starving, but the fear of getting caught was paralyzing. I was too afraid to rummage through the kitchen, so I just grabbed a single bottle of water and quietly made my way up into their attic. Once inside the roof space, I started creeping around, carefully mapping out where the creaky floorboards were and finding a flat spot where I could lie down. The attic was not cozy at all. It was incredibly cold and pitch black. For some strange reason, I had imagined it would be brighter, like that old Christmas Vacation movie. I silently shifted some cardboard boxes around and poked through their storage looking for a blanket. I finally found a musty old blanket that smelled heavily of cat urine. I used it to make a makeshift bed right in the middle of a pile of dusty Halloween decorations and other random household junk. Then I sat in the dark and waited for them to return. After multiple hours of absolute silence, I heard the heavy thud of the front door opening downstairs. Another massive wave of anxiety overcame me. My heart started pounding so violently in my chest, I thought it would give me away. That was also the moment I realized a terrifying logistical truth. You cannot actually hear clear details through the floorboards like you see in the movies. Everything was just a dull, muffled vibration. Based on the footsteps, I assumed it was Jane. I would sometimes hear her walk directly beneath my spot, subtly singing to herself. A few hours later, John came home. I spent most of that evening sitting completely frozen, afraid to even shift my weight. I only went to sleep when I heard their bedroom lights go off. The next day, I awoke to the sharp sound of the front door closing. I immediately put my ear flat against the dusty floor to figure out the situation. I could hear Jane's voice talking to someone. It took me a few days of observation to fully realize what was happening. Because of the global pandemic, Jane was working from home full-time. This completely ruined my plan of having the house to myself during the day. Because of her constant presence, I had to adapt. I started sneaking downstairs exclusively at night or during the very rare moments when both of them left the property. To manage this safely, I found a clever trick. I sneaked into the kitchen one night and used my phone to copy down Jane's entire weekly schedule directly from the calendar on their fridge. Taking that specific knowledge and combining it with a fixed work schedule John and I used to share at our old job, I could calculate a very precise window of when the house would be completely empty. This bizarre routine continued for days, then weeks, and then months. As time passed, the initial terror began to fade, and I became subtly brazen. I started sneaking more of their food, taking longer risks, and dealing with some incredibly close calls. The absolute closest I ever came to getting caught was when December arrived. They unexpectedly came up into the attic to grab their boxes of Christmas decorations. If you remember, I had built my hidden nook inside the pile of Halloween decorations, so I was fairly confident they wouldn't look through that specific section. But that knowledge did not make the situation any less terrifying. I lay flat on my stomach, completely paralyzed, as John made a sudden joke about how awful it smelled up there. He literally said it smelled like onions and cat piss. I completely held my breath, praying to God he wouldn't start searching for the source of the odor. Luckily, they left the house for an entire week to visit Jane's family for the holidays. That week was heaven. I showered daily, slept in their comfortable bed, and ate any food I could get my hands on. By the time late February came around, the psychological toll was too much. I realized I was risking it too much. I was sneaking massive amounts of food, using their shower, and admittedly, I had even slipped into their hallway a few times just to watch them sleep. I decided it was time to sneak out for good and never return. During those months in the dark, I actually developed a very powerful, unhealthily strong parasocial relationship with them. When I left, I actually took some of their clothes and random personal items with me. I still have them. I feel immense guilt for what I did, but enough time has passed that I feel comfortable sharing this online. Obviously, I would never tell them the truth. However, I started following both of them on social media under a fake account. I still watch their lives to this day. Not long ago, they had a baby girl, and she is absolutely beautiful. Cultural note. In the United States, the economic lockdowns of 2020 created a massive surge in residential phrogging, a slang term derived from frogs hopping from place to place, where displaced individuals secretly inhabited the crawl spaces or attics of occupied homes. This phenomenon was heavily exacerbated by the rapid transition to remote work, which forced intruders to develop highly sophisticated tracking methods, such as monitoring smart home routines or refrigerator calendars, to avoid direct confrontations with residents. My old neighbors had a random guy frogging up in their attic for a significant period of time. The intruder managed to hang out up there for months before anybody in the household ever suspected a thing. At first, a bunch of food items simply went missing from the kitchen. We are talking about hot wings, fresh biscuits, and even random corn. The lady of the house would spend the evening cooking a nice dinner, carefully save the leftovers in containers, and wake up the next morning only to find everything completely vanished. One night, she even discovered a half-eaten chili dog sitting right on the shelf inside the fridge. It looked exactly like someone had taken a massive bite out of it and then just walked off mid-chew. It was incredibly unsettling. Then came the day when the truth finally caught up with him. While the lady was sitting downstairs quietly reading a book, a strange, deep rumbling sound came echoing right through the ventilation shaft. It sounded exactly like a wild animal growling in the dark. She stood up, completely confused, and muttered to herself, "What is that?" She cautiously went upstairs and followed the heavy vibrations all the way to the back utility room. She pushed the door open, and there he was. The guy was absolutely massive, literally bigger than her Buick. He was lying belly up right on the floorboards, snoring like a wild bear. The intruder had a bottle of vodka clutched in one hand, a bag of pork rinds in the other, and dried food crusted all over his messy beard. The lady did not even hesitate. She looked right at him and screamed, "Get out of here!" Surprisingly, the guy just scrambled to his feet and ran out of the property. He never returned to the house again. The wildest part came during the police follow-up. It turned out the guy actually lived just a single mile down the exact same road. When questioned, he casually explained that he only sneaked into their attic whenever he and his wife got into heated arguments, and she kicked him out of the house. Absolute wild stuff. Cultural note. In suburban American housing layouts, central HVAC systems utilize interconnected ductwork and large ventilation shafts that frequently run directly through the attic space before distributing air to the lower levels. These metal vents act as natural acoustic amplifiers, allowing heavy sounds like snoring or movement from an intruder in the roof to travel clearly into specific downstairs rooms. About 10 years ago, I was renting a room in this massive old house. The property was huge, and there were several different tenants living there at the exact same time. A couple rented out one of the bedrooms on my floor. A single woman lived in another room right down the hall, and there was another couple who occupied the entire top floor of the structure. The people on the top floor kept to themselves and rarely came down to the rest of the house. But the rest of us on the middle floor regularly shared the main kitchen downstairs, the communal bathroom, and all the common areas like the living room, the library, and the dining room. To add to the traffic, our landlord maintained a private office on the ground floor. Because of that setup, there was a non-stop flow of people walking in and out of the building every single day. We always tried our best to keep the main entrance locked, but with so many people moving around, it just didn't always happen. Someone would always forget to turn the deadbolt. A lot of times, you would walk into the kitchen or the hallway and spot unfamiliar faces hanging around, but nobody ever panicked. You just assumed that one of the other roommates was having a friend or a guest over for the afternoon. This casual routine went on for about 2 full months. During that time, I noticed this one specific guy popping up here and there in the shadows of the house, but I never questioned his presence. Everything changed when the single woman living on my floor finally ran into him near the stairs. The moment she saw his face, she completely lost it and frantically called the police. As it turns out, she actually recognized him from her past. He wasn't anyone's guest, and nobody had invited him into the property. The guy had been secretly sneaking inside through the unlatched doors and was living entirely out of our dark basement for weeks without a single soul knowing about it. I honestly forget the exact details of how she knew his identity, but judging by the sheer panic in her voice and the speed of the police response, they were definitely not on good terms. Cultural note: in suburban American college towns and large communal rentals, historic multi-story houses are frequently converted into shared rooming facilities. Security experts note that these high-traffic environments are highly susceptible to blind spot intrusion, where a stranger can easily blend into the daily routines of multiple independent tenants who do not cross-reference their visitor logs, allowing an intruder to occupy utility basements undetected for months. My husband and I are convinced that someone was secretly living inside our garage for a significant amount of time. The layout of our property was a bit unusual. The garage was attached to the main house by an enclosed breezeway, featuring a back door that led straight into the yard. That specific door had a large built-in doggy door. At first, we simply started noticing that the back door was constantly left unlocked. For a couple of weeks, we just silently blamed each other for being careless and locked it back up. This back and forth continued until one evening we finally talked about it. It turns out neither of us could even recall having used that specific entrance any time recently. We made sure to double lock it that night, but the next morning, it was unlatched again. Around that same time, I came home late from work a few times and noticed something weird. The moment I pulled into the driveway and opened the main garage door, I saw that the back door to my husband's car was wide open. Back then, he drove an old, spacious station wagon. The vehicle had a massive cargo area in the back, filled with thick winter blankets. Looking back, it would have been a decent warm place for someone to get some sleep. I mentioned the open car door to my husband. He could not remember touching the vehicle after getting home, but we both just assumed he was being incredibly forgetful or distracted. On a couple of different occasions, our dog started growling and barking aggressively at the interior door that led straight into the garage area. We tried to brush it off, thinking maybe the neighbor's cat had sneaked through the doggy door to hang out in the breezeway. But deep down, we knew our pets did not usually react like that unless there was an actual person standing directly on the other side. The final red flags were the random items that kept popping up in the garage, objects that definitely did not belong to anyone in our household. First, we found a purple water bottle without a lid sitting on a workbench. A few days later, a hairbrush with stamped initials we did not recognize appeared near the car. Finally, we spotted a handful of used scratch-off lottery tickets tossed in the corner. Strangely enough, nothing valuable ever went missing from our property, and we never actually caught a glimpse of the intruder. All the weird occurrences stopped the exact day we decided to permanently board up and cover that large doggy door. It was probably just someone going through a terrible situation who did not mean us any harm, but I definitely did not want to risk coming home late at night and accidentally spooking a desperate stranger who might have turned violent when cornered in the dark. Cultural note: in suburban American architecture, a breezeway is a roofed, open-sided passage connecting a house to an adjacent structure like a garage. While common in mid-20th century home designs, these spaces often create significant security vulnerabilities, particularly when equipped with oversized pet doors that lack modern electronic locking mechanisms synced to an animal's collar microchip. I was a toddler, barely 2 years old, when this situation unfolded inside our household, meaning I lack any direct memory of the events. However, the chilling weight of the logistics was revealed to me by my family decades later, transforming what they casually dismissed as a strange anecdote into my absolute worst recurring nightmare. From what I was able to piece together, the intruder was a transient individual riding the cargo rails who had abandoned the train tracks located at the bottom of the hill. In our small rural town, seeing these travelers was completely normal, but our property sat isolated on the perimeter, bordered by a dense, unmonitored wilderness line. The subject scaled the exterior structure of the house until he located a large ventilation shaft in the roofing, an opening wide enough to allow an adult male to slide straight into our attic insulation without triggering any exterior sensors. The truly terrifying aspect of our household dynamic was that 7 people shared the structure, and not a single adult ever bothered to put a padlock or lock on the main entry doors. Under that total lack of structural prevention, the house became an ideal habitat for an active frogger. Whenever household items shifted positions in the kitchen, half-consumed food containers appeared in the hallways, or clean laundry went missing, every member of the family automatically assumed that another resident had misplaced it. The intruder operated with complete impunity within the blind spots of our chaotic daily routine. For weeks on end, my parents noticed distinct scratching and rhythmic shuffling sounds coming from the ceiling boards during the dead of night. Yet, they actively chose to normalize the threat, attributing the auditory cues to rodents or the house settling under shifting winds. My parents were incredibly oblivious and detached when it came to the physical security of our living space, displaying a level of neglect that still shocks me. The situation reached its breaking point on a winter afternoon, driven by a casual desire to inspect the alleged pest issue. My dad set up a ladder and poked his head through the ceiling hatch. In the absolute darkness of the attic space, his flashlight beam did not reveal animal nests. Instead, it illuminated a grown man crouching in the far corner, surrounded by stolen family items, staring directly down at the open floor hatch. The most horrifying detail uncovered during the structural sweep was that the intruder's sleeping layout sat directly above the nursery room where my crib was placed. This stranger had been slipping down the attic ladder at night, walking through the corridors, and watching over me in the pitch black, while 6 adults slept with unlocked doors just down the hall. Instead of backing away quietly and immediately contacting emergency dispatchers to secure the perimeter, my father, acting with a baffling and highly irresponsible lack of urgency, simply confronted the individual and told him to leave the property right then and there. The intruder slid down the external structure and vanished into the thick woods before anyone else could react. The entire incident was intentionally buried and minimized throughout my childhood until a cousin casually joked about it during a family holiday dinner. In that exact microsecond, the true horror hit me. I had spent my infancy sharing the same air with a complete stranger who monitored my every move from the shadows of the roof, all because of a deadbolt that was never turned. Cultural note: in rural American towns near major railroad lines, the subculture of riding the rails often intersected with remote residential areas. While historical transients typically stayed close to rail yards, security experts note that properties bordering wilderness lines were highly vulnerable to long-term intrusion if structures featured large attic vents designed for high-volume airflow, which lacked internal security mesh or physical barriers. The normalization of nocturnal noises under the assumption of rodent infestations remains the primary psychological factor that allows prolonged phrogging to coexist alongside unsuspecting families. There was a notoriously freaky incident that went down recently involving a guy renting a tiny studio apartment right in the middle of New York City. He was sharing the small layout with his girlfriend, but over the course of a few weeks, the space started feeling slightly off. Every single morning he would head into the kitchen to make breakfast and notice that random food items were completely missing from the fridge and the pantry. Since the apartment was so small and secure, he logically figured his girlfriend was just sleepwalking or dealing with a late-night case of sleep eating. When he confronted her about the missing snacks, she completely denied it, looking genuinely confused. To clear the air and catch her in the act, he decided to buy a small hidden camera and set it up facing the kitchen counter. What he ended up discovering on that footage the next morning was much scarier than a sleepwalking partner. The hidden camera footage captured the absolute nightmare scene in the middle of the night. The lens caught a strange, disheveled woman slowly unscrewing and crawling directly out of the main air duct vent located in the high ceiling. She carefully lowered her body down into the kitchen space, stepping onto the counter without making a single vibration. She helped herself to whatever food and drinks she wanted from the shelves, even drinking directly out of their milk carton. The terrifying part was her movement. She was so stealth and dead silent that you couldn't hear a single thud through the walls. At one point in the video, the guy actually got up in the middle of the night to walk to the kitchen for a simple glass of water. The moment she heard the bedroom door handle click, the woman frantically scurried back up the wall and vanished into the narrow air duct, mere moments before he entered the kitchen frame. Absolute scary stuff. Cultural note: in crowded metropolitan areas like New York City, older commercial buildings converted into studio apartments frequently retain interconnected, oversized HVAC ventilation shafts. These structural tunnels run continuously between floors without internal security grates, allowing displaced individuals or serial squatters to navigate the hidden passages of the complex and access private apartments undetected through the ceiling vents. When I was in my early 20s, I ended up dog-sitting for a week at my uncle's place, completely by myself. It was January, and it was freezing outside. The house was originally built by my grandfather for his sister, who passed away when I was about 6 years old. She died young from cancer. My only memories of her are from those last days when she was in hospice care, right in the living room. Everyone in the family loved her, and I always wish I could have known her better. A few years after she passed, my uncle and his partner bought the property and completely renovated it. It's actually a pretty nice place, especially considering the structure was built back in the early 70s. So, after my uncle handed me the keys and showed me how to operate the home security system, I settled in. I was excited to have the entire space to myself, especially since I usually lived with roommates and never really got any alone time. But what started as a relaxing week quickly turned into something much more unsettling. On the second day of my stay, we got hit with a severe Arctic vortex. Everything outside was quickly covered in thick ice and heavy snow. I was basically trapped inside the layout. That second night, I just couldn't fall asleep. I lay there in the dark for hours, counting sheep. At some point, I started hearing muffled voices that seemed to be coming from outside. I remember thinking, wow, you can really hear the neighbors in this subdivision. Then about 20 minutes later, the home security system went off with a loud chime. That freaked me out, so I scrambled out of bed to check the digital panel. The screen read, "Basement door ajar." I didn't know what else to do, so I grabbed a kitchen knife, definitely not my brightest idea, got the dog, and headed downstairs into the dark. Now, the basement is completely unfinished, and there's a heavy sliding glass door down there. My uncle always places a thick wooden bar in the track to keep it from opening, even if the lock is unlatched. When I got down there, the door was wide open, and the wooden bar had been completely removed from the track. The ground outside was covered in fresh snow, but curiously, there were no footprints leading up to the glass. I thought about calling the cops, but then I remembered the stash of green I had found in the basement earlier and decided against it. To make things worse, I had taken a strong sleeping pill about 10 minutes before all this happened, so my body was getting heavier and heavier as I searched the corners. Eventually, I just collapsed from exhaustion on the bed. When I told my friends and family about it later, most of them were highly skeptical. They said I probably left the door unlocked, and that maybe the dog opened it somehow. But that didn't make any sense. The dog had been sleeping in my room, and no way could an animal remove a heavy bar and slide open a jammed door. What really got to me later was a terrifying logistical realization. The sliding door couldn't physically be unlatched from the outside. That meant someone or something was already inside the house trying to get out. That made it even creepier. Anyway, that was just the beginning of the weird stuff. The next night, I was lounging on the couch, watching movies, when I heard a soft thump, thump against the side of the house. It sounded exactly like someone was throwing a tennis ball against the exterior wall. At first, I brushed it off as just the utility pipes settling in an old house. But then it happened on the opposite side of the structure. Thump, thump. The sound started moving around to different sides of the property, always in the exact same rhythmic order. It repeated this precise pattern 3 times before moving to another part of the framing. This went on for about 2 hours, and I was getting really frustrated and annoyed by the constant knocking. Then just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Over the next few days, I started noticing things being subtly out of place. I'd set an object down, and later it would be somewhere else entirely. At first, I thought I was just being forgetful. So, I decided to get more organized. I started closing doors behind me to make sure I wouldn't misplace things. I even laid out my work uniform and shoes on the kitchen table to make getting ready in the mornings easier. When the ice and snow finally cleared up, I prepared to head back to work. That morning, I got up early, took a hot shower, and everything seemed fine. None of my stuff was out of place, and I was about to head out the door. I saw my shirt and shoes at the table and thought, great, everything's here and going smoothly. But when I bent down to tie my shoes and reached for my shirt, the fabric was completely gone. I had just seen it folded and ready to go the night before, and now it was missing. I started feeling crazy as I searched the house, getting more and more stressed about being late for work. Eventually, I found my shirt in the spare bedroom, crumpled up in a tight ball and thrown into the dark corner of the room. I was so confused and frustrated as I made my way to work. Later that day when I got back, I let the dog out through the basement sliding door. As I sat inside, avoiding the cold, I heard soft footsteps upstairs, moving from one side of the house to the other. I grabbed the dog and checked the whole place again, but, of course, I found nothing. At this point, I started doubting my own sanity. I wondered if I was slipping into some kind of severe psychosis. The footsteps happened again the next day. On the last day of my stay, one of my friends came over to help me tidy up the house before my uncle returned. We were sitting downstairs while the dog was outside, both of us looking at our phones, when I heard the footsteps again. My friend didn't believe me at first when I told her about all the weird things happening, but this time I decided to stay quiet and see if she heard it too. Suddenly, she looked up at me with wide, scared eyes. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. "There's someone up there," she said, pointing directly in the direction of the ceiling as the footsteps moved from one side of the house to the other. Then she jumped up from the chair and said, "I'm leaving right now." I had never felt so vindicated in my life. After doubting me the entire time, she was suddenly terrified. When my uncle and his partner got back, I asked them if they had ever experienced anything strange in the house. My uncle's partner casually admitted he once saw a woman in a white dress walking down their hallway. He also sometimes hears music playing from nowhere. Strangely though, my uncle's dog never acted weird during my stay. If he had, it would have freaked me out even more. I still struggle to make sense of what happened. Sometimes I wonder if there was someone secretly hiding in the house, living in some unchecked corner or utility crawl space. But then again, I don't think a normal person could have done some of the physical things I experienced. It's troubling, to say the least. Have any of you felt conflicted after experiencing similar phenomena? Felt like an experience could be due to a person hiding rather than a haunting? Honestly, I almost want to believe it was just a person, but if it really was an intruder behind all that, I'd be way more freaked out than if it were just a ghost. Cultural note. In older suburban American subdivisions developed during the early 1970s, split-level and ranch-style houses were frequently built with integrated utility chases and drop-down ceiling panels for central ventilation access. These architectural bypasses often allow specialized access across different sectors of the house, meaning an intruder could technically move between the attic insulation and the lower basement tracking frames without ever crossing the main interior hallways visible to the residents. If you like these stories, make sure to subscribe to the Reddit Oracle.